The Windover Canyon Diablo knows how to keep a secret. It scours the truth from the bones of the dead and buries it under a fine red dust. Out here, on the edge of everything, you learn to listen to that wind. You learn that some secrets are best left buried, and that a blindfolded girl, tied to a dead scrub cedar at the lip of the abyss, is a secret you walk away from. If you want to live, the scout saw her first as a smudge of white against the rust-colored rock, a flicker of something that didn't belong. His name was Kyle, and the land spoke to him in a language older than words. He moved without sound, a ghost in buckskin, his eyes missing nothing. He'd been tracking a mountain cat that had been preying on his tribe's horses, but this was no cat. He crested the last rise, the wind whipping his long black hair across his weathered face, and he saw her. She was maybe 16, 17 years old. Her dress was fine linen, the kind settlers' daughters wore to church, now torn and stained with dust. A strip of that same linen was tied tight across her eyes. Her hands were bound to the skeletal branches of the cedar. She wasn't struggling. She was perfectly still, as if she'd accepted it, as if she was just waiting for the sun or the coyotes to claim her. Cal stopped. He melted back into the shadows of the junipers, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. Every instinct, honed by a lifetime of survival in a world that wanted him dead, screamed at him to turn back. This was white man trouble, and white man trouble always spilled over, leaving a trail of blood that never washed away. He watched her for a long time. The wind molded the thin fabric of her dress to her body. She was trembling, but not from the cold. He could see the fine, uncontrollable shudders running through her. He should have walked away. It was the smart play. The only play. His duty was to his people, not to some lost girl left as a sacrifice to the desert. He had his own ghost to wrestle. He didn't need to take on hers. He took one step back, then another. The soft soles of his moccasins made no sound on the rock. He could be gone, vanish. She would never know he was even there. But then she spoke. Her voice was a dry, cracked whisper addressed to the empty air. "Is someone there?" Kyle froze. The sound of her voice, so small against the vast, indifferent emptiness of the canyon, was like a hook in his gut. He stayed silent, a statue of shadow and stone. Maybe she'd heard a lizard skittering on the rocks. Maybe it was just the wind. "Please," she whispered and her voice broke. "If you are going to kill me, just do it now." He should have kept walking. He knew it, but his feet wouldn't move. He had seen enough death. He had dealt enough of it in a past he tried every day to forget. He let out a slow breath, the air hissing between his teeth. He was a fool, but he was not a coward. He stepped out of the shadows. She flinched at the sound of his footsteps on the gravel, her whole body tensing. She couldn't see him, but she could feel him, a sudden presence in her desolate world. Kyle said nothing. Words were a currency he rarely spent. He walked to her, his movements fluid and unhurried. He pulled the heavy blade from his belt. The sunlight flashed on the polished steel. She gasped, a small choke sound, and turned her head away, bracing for the blow. Instead, she felt the cool edge of the knife slide between her wrists, severing the rope with a single, clean slice. Her hands fell free. They were raw and bleeding. He moved behind her, cutting the rope that bound her to the tree. She staggered forward, her legs weak, and he put out a steadying hand, his fingers barely brushing her shoulder. She stood there, swaying, her hands still in front of her, as if the ropes were ghosts. The blindfold was the last thing left. He reached for it. His calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle as he worked the knot loose. The strip of linen fell away. She kept her eyes closed for a moment, her long lashes dark against her pale, dirt-streaked cheeks. Then slowly, she opened them. Cal's breath caught in his throat. He had expected the terrified blue or brown eyes of a settler girl. He was wrong. Her eyes were the color of twilight, a deep, stormy violet, flecked with silver. Eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrows of the world. He took a step back, an old superstition whispering in his mind. He pulled a water skin from his belt and held it out. She took it with trembling hands, drinking greedily, the water spilling down her chin. When she was done, she looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. She saw the hard lines of his face, his dark, unreadable eyes, the knife still in his hand. "Thank you," she whispered. He just gave a curt nod, his face a mask of stone. He was already regretting this. This girl with her strange, haunted eyes was a trouble deeper than any canyon. He turned to leave. He had done what his conscience demanded. He had cut her free. Now she was on her own. But her voice stopped him. "Wait," she said, and her voice was filled with a new, sharp terror. "You can't leave me. They're coming back." Kyle stopped, his back still to her. The wind swirled around them, carrying her words down into the echoing depths of the canyon. They. The word was a poison dart. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area around the cedar tree. He hadn't seen it before, focused as he was on the girl. But now he saw the signs. The ground was scuffed, disturbed, the tracks of shod horses and heavy boots. At least 4 men. They hadn't just left her here. They had brought her, deliberately. He walked the perimeter, his eyes reading the story in the dust. These weren't the sloppy tracks of bandits or drifters. The horses were heavy, well-fed. The men wore military-style boots with distinctive heel plates. This was organized, disciplined, and that was far more dangerous. He found something else. A single spent rifle cartridge, half buried in the sand. He picked it up. It wasn't the standard army issue. It was a Sharps cartridge, expensive and powerful. The kind of thing a wealthy man or a professional hunter might use. This whole thing felt wrong. The fine dress, the strange eyes, the professional-looking tracks. The pieces didn't fit. He walked back to the girl. She hadn't moved. She just stood there, clutching the water skin to her chest like a shield. "Who is they?" he asked, his voice a low rasp, rough from disuse. She flinched, wrapping her arms around herself. I don't know their names. They took my father. They were asking him questions about his work." "What work?" "He's a surveyor," she said, "for the new railroad expansion. He was mapping this territory. A railroad surveyor. That explained some things, but it created 100 new questions. Why would anyone kidnap a surveyor and leave his daughter tied to a tree?" Cal looked east, then west. There was no sign of a wagon, no sign of a struggle. It was as if she had simply appeared here. "They said they would be back for me," she whispered, her violet eyes wide with a terror that was chillingly real. "They said I was the key." The key. The word made no sense, but it sent a shiver down Kel's spine. He had learned long ago that when things didn't make sense in this land, it was usually because the truth was something so dark you couldn't bear to look at it directly. He was in over his head. He knew it. He should give her the water skin, point her in the direction of the nearest fort, and walk away. But he looked at her face, at the raw terror in those strange, beautiful eyes, and he saw something else. He saw the memory of another face, another pair of frightened eyes from a long time ago. A memory he had tried to bury under years of silence and solitude. He let out a curse under his breath, in his own language, a curse on his own soft heart. He turned and started walking west, away from the canyon. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He just walked. After a few moments, he heard her, the soft, uncertain crunch of her thin shoes on the gravel, hurrying to keep up. He hadn't offered her safety. He hadn't offered her a ride or protection. He hadn't even offered her his name. He had just offered her a direction. And for now, in a world that had tried to erase her, that was enough. The journey began in silence, a grueling, sun-drenched trek through a landscape that was all sharp edges and hidden teeth. Kyle set a relentless pace, and the girl, whose name he still didn't know, struggled to keep up. Her city shoes were shredded within the first hour, her feet cut and bleeding, but she never complained. She just clenched her jaw and kept moving. He saw her stumble, fall to her knees, and push herself back up, again and again. There was a core of stubborn steel in her that he hadn't expected. By midday, he knew she couldn't go on. He found a small shaded overhang, a shallow cave carved into the side of a mesa. He stopped, dropped his pack, and started a small, smokeless fire. He turned to find her leaning against the rock wall, her face pale, her breathing shallow. He took a strip of clean linen from his pack and knelt in front of her. He gestured to her feet. She hesitated for a moment, then slowly sat, lifting her bruised and bloody feet for him to see. He worked in silence, cleaning the cuts with water from his canteen and wrapping them in the linen. His touch was efficient, impersonal, but she still flinched when his fingers brushed her skin. "My name is Ilara," she said suddenly, her voice quiet. Cal grunted, tying off the last bandage. He didn't offer his name in return. Names were for friends. This was a complication, a problem he was trying to solve. Nothing more. He passed her a piece of dried jerky. She chewed it slowly, gratefully. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Away," he said. It was the only answer he had. As the sun began to set, they saw them. A patrol of riders, silhouetted against the blood-red sky. The same men. Cal could tell by the way they sat their horses, the disciplined way they moved. They were sweeping the area in a grid pattern, searching. Cal pulled Alara deeper into the shadows of the cave. He watched the riders, his face grim. They were good. Too good. They would find this place by morning. As they passed, one of the riders paused, looking directly toward their hiding spot. For a heart-stopping moment, Kyle thought they'd been seen. But the rider was looking at something on Alara. Kyle followed his gaze. A small dark mark was visible on the inside of her wrist, where the sleeve of her dress was torn. A brand. The rider said something to the man next to him, then they moved on. But the image was burned into Cale's mind. After they were gone, he lit a small piece of tinder, the tiny flame casting flickering shadows on the cave wall. "Let me see your wrist," he commanded, his voice low and hard. Alara instinctively pulled her arm back, her eyes wide with fear. "It's nothing." He didn't ask again. He simply reached out and took her arm, his grip firm but not rough. He pushed back the tattered sleeve. There, on the pale skin of her inner wrist, was a brand. It wasn't the crude mark of a cattle ranch. It was an intricate design, a serpent eating its own tail, the symbol of a circle that never ends. It was partially healed, but the scar tissue was stark and angry. She was marked. Property. But the way that rider had looked at it, it wasn't just a mark of ownership. It was a sign, a signal. "What is this?" Cale demanded. Ilara wouldn't answer. She just stared at the flickering flame, her jaw tight, her violet eyes like dark, stormy pools. The silence in the small cave was suddenly heavy, suffocating. It was filled with the weight of her secrets, secrets that were going to get them both killed. He knew then that this was about more than a kidnapped girl. He had stumbled into something far more complex, a hidden war being fought in the shadows of this vast, empty land. And the girl in front of him wasn't just a victim. She was a piece on the board, and he had no idea what game they were playing. The brand changed everything. It was a lock, and Cal didn't have the key. He looked from the ugly scar on her wrist to the terror in her eyes, and he knew he couldn't force the truth from her. Not yet. He also knew they couldn't stay. The patrol would be back. "We move," he said, kicking dirt over the small flame. "Now!" They traveled through the night, a desperate, moon-shadowed flight. The darkness was a shroud, but it was also a shield. Cal moved with a familiar, predatory grace, his senses alive to every sound, every shift in the wind. Ilara followed, a silent ghost at his heels. Her fear had sharpened her. She learned to place her feet where he did, to use the rocks and shadows for cover, to become a part of the night. Just before dawn, they found refuge, a place from Cale's past, a small, hidden settlement of outcasts, nestled in a box canyon so remote it didn't appear on any map. It was a place called Haven, populated by army deserters, disgraced prospectors, and natives who had been cast out from their own tribes. It was a town of ghosts, a place to disappear. The welcome was wary. A man named Silas, the town's unofficial leader, met them at the entrance, a shotgun held loosely in his hands. Silas was a former army sergeant, a big man with a face like a slab of granite and eyes that had seen too much. He and Cale had served together a lifetime ago. "Kyle," Silas grunted, his eyes flicking to the exhausted girl beside him. "I thought the desert had swallowed you whole. You've brought trouble." "Trouble found me," Kyle replied. "We need a place to rest, just for a day." Silas studied Alara, his gaze lingering on her torn, expensive dress and her strange, violet eyes. "She's not from around here." "She's with me," Cale said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Silas hesitated, then gave a weary nod. "One day, then you're on your own. We've got enough ghosts in Haven. We don't need any new ones." He gave them a room in the back of the dilapidated saloon, a small, windowless space with 2 cots and a door that could be barred from the inside. For the first time in 2 days, they were safe, or so they thought. Ilara collapsed on one of the cots, asleep before her head hit the thin pillow. Cal watched her for a moment, the lines of exhaustion and fear on her young face. While she slept, he took the opportunity to search the small satchel she'd been carrying, a desperate move born of a desperate situation. He didn't find much: a comb, a small, worn book of poetry, and tucked into a hidden pocket, a locket. It was heavy, made of silver, and intricately carved with the same serpent symbol that was branded on her wrist. He pried it open. It didn't contain a portrait. It held a small, strangely shaped key. It was unlike any key he had ever seen, with a complex, star-shaped pattern. He was staring at it when her voice, small and sharp, cut through the silence. "Give that back." He turned. She was sitting up on the cot, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and fury. "What does it open?" Kyle asked, his voice flat. "It's all I have left of my father," she said, her voice trembling. "Please." "What does it open, Ilara?" he repeated. Before she could answer, a commotion erupted outside. Shouts. The sound of a horse galloping into town. Cal moved to the door, cracking it open an inch. He could see Silas in the street talking to a frantic-looking prospector. "They're here!" the prospector was yelling. "A whole damn company of them, setting up a command post at the old fort. They're closing off the whole valley." Silas's head snapped around, his eyes finding Cale in the doorway. The look on his face was grim. They weren't just being hunted anymore. They were being trapped. The entire valley was being turned into a cage, and Cale suddenly understood that the men hunting them weren't just some band of mercenaries. They were something else, something far more powerful. He looked back at the strange key in his hand, then at the girl on the cot. He finally knew, with a sickening certainty, that he wasn't just protecting a girl. He was protecting a secret that someone was willing to start a war over. A command post? Cal's mind was racing. Fort Determination? It's been abandoned for 10 years. "Not anymore," Silas said, walking towards him, his face dark. "This prospector says they've got supplies, heavy wagons, even a Gatling gun. They're not passing through, Cal. They're digging in." This was an occupation. A private army was seizing control of a U.S. territory. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. Whoever was behind this had immense power and influence, the kind of power that could make soldiers and laws simply disappear. Cal barred the door to their room and turned to face Ilara. He held up the locket and the key. "No more lies," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The truth, all of it, now." Ilara flinched, but she saw the look in his eyes. The time for secrets was over. "My father's name was Alistair Finch," she began, her voice low and steady. "He wasn't just a surveyor, he was a historian, a scholar. The railroad was just a cover. He was searching for something, a place that was supposed to be a myth." She took a shaky breath. "He called it the Library of Alexandria of the West, a hidden vault built by a secret society of thinkers and scientists who fled Europe in the 1700s. They called themselves the Ouroboros Society." She pointed to the brand on her wrist, the serpent. Kyle stared at her, his skepticism warring with the impossible facts. A private army, a strange key. It was insane, but it was happening. "They brought their knowledge with them," she continued. "Science, philosophy, engineering, discoveries years ahead of their time. They hid it all away in a vault, here in these canyons, to protect it from the wars and greed of the outside world. The brand on my wrist marks me as a descendant of one of the founding families. We were the guardians." "And your father found it," Cale finished for her. "He found it," she confirmed, "but someone else was looking for it too. A man who wanted to use that knowledge not to build, but to destroy, to control." "Who?" "I only know his name," she whispered. Thorn. The name meant nothing to Cale, but it was a start. The key, he said, holding it up. It opens a lockbox my father kept, she explained. It's in a bank in Prescott. Inside are his journals, the final coordinates to the vault. He sent me ahead with the key while he went back for the rest of his maps. But Thorne's men were waiting for him. She choked back a sob. They left me at the canyon to send a message. They thought I would die. They didn't know I had the real key on me. So that was the prize. Not gold, not silver, but knowledge. Knowledge that could build new weapons, new machines. Knowledge that could make a man like Thorne a king. A hard knock rattled the door. Kyle, it's Silas. You need to see this. Kyle unbarred the door. Silas stood there, his face pale. One of Thorne's lieutenants just rode into town. He's asking questions about you. Kyle's blood ran cold. But he's not asking for Kyle, Silas said, his eyes wide. He's asking for the coyote. It was a name Cale hadn't heard in 15 years, a name he had earned as a young scout for the U.S. Army, a name he thought he had buried in the blood and dust of the war, a name known only to one man. And that's when the second, more terrifying piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The man leading this army wasn't a stranger. It was Captain Julian Thorne, Cale's former commanding officer, the man he had betrayed, the man who had sworn to hunt him to the ends of the earth. This wasn't just business. It wasn't just a hunt for a mythical library. It was personal. Thorne wasn't just after the key. He was after him. This entire sprawling operation was also a trap, laid with years of patience and bottomless resources. A trap for the scout who had deserted him. A trap for the coyote who had gotten away. The name echoed in the dusty room like a gunshot from the past. The coyote, a ghost Cale thought he'd outrun. He remembered Thorne, a man carved from ambition and cruelty, with a collector's passion for rare and beautiful things. Not just art or jewels, but people. Secrets. Cale had been one of his prizes, a scout with an almost supernatural ability to read the land. Until the day Cale witnessed Thorne's men massacre a small, peaceful village of Pima natives to seize a piece of land Thorne wanted. That was the day the coyote vanished, taking with him Thorne's maps and a burning hatred for the uniform he wore. Now Thorne was here, and he had an army. He's offering a bounty, Silas said, his voice grim. $5,000 for you, dead or alive. The air in the room went thin. $5,000 was a fortune. It was enough to make a man betray his own brother. The fragile piece of haven was about to shatter. The town of ghosts was about to become a hunting ground. We have to leave, Kyle said, his mind already working, calculating angles, escape routes. There are no escape routes, Silas countered. They've got patrols on every pass out of this valley. You're boxed in. Ilara stood up, her face pale but resolute. The vault, she said. My father told me there are other ways out. Tunnels. The society built them in case the valley was ever compromised. Cale and Silas both stared at her. If we can get to the vault, she continued, her voice gaining strength, we can use those tunnels to get out of the valley, and we'll have the journals. We'll have proof of what Thorne is doing. It was an insane, desperate plan, a direct assault on the one place Thorne would be guarding most heavily, but it was also the only plan they had. Before they could even begin to argue the details, a single gunshot rang out from the street. It was followed by a scream. Cale looked out the door. The lieutenant from Thorne's army stood over the body of the prospector who had first warned them, a smoking pistol in his hand. The bounty is now active, the lieutenant announced, his voice carrying across the silent town. The town of Haven is under quarantine. No one leaves. Find me the scout and the girl. Anyone who helps them will be considered an enemy of this operation. The trap had been sprung. The doors of the cage had slammed shut. Silas looked at Cale, his face a mask of grim resolve. This is our town, Cale. He doesn't get to make the rules here. He hefted his shotgun. You and the girl need to get to that vault. We'll buy you some time. The ghosts of Haven were about to go to war. The town erupted into a chaotic symphony of gunfire. The handful of residents in Haven, outcasts and deserters to a man, were not the kind of people who took orders from outsiders. They grabbed their old rifles and pistols, taking cover in doorways and on rooftops, turning their ramshackle town into a fortress. It was a battle they couldn't win, but they could delay the inevitable. "There's a hidden path behind the stables," Silas yelled at Kale over the din. "It leads up into the high rocks. It'll get you past their first line. Go! Now!" Kyle grabbed Alara's hand. "Stay with me. Do exactly as I say." They ran. They sprinted across the open space between the saloon and the stables, bullets kicking up dust around their feet. They scrambled up a steep, narrow trail, the sounds of the battle fading below them. They didn't stop until they reached the cover of the high canyons, their lungs burning, their bodies screaming in protest. Below them, Haven was a war zone, but Silas and his people were holding. They had bought them the time they needed. "Which way to the vault?" Kyle asked, his voice tight. Ilara closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's not a place you find with your eyes," she said. "My father taught me how to listen for it. There's a resonance, a hum in the rock that the founders built into it. I can feel it." Kyle watched her, a new respect dawning. She wasn't just a girl with a secret. She was something more. She led them on a winding path through the labyrinth of canyons, her hand often trailing along the rock walls, as if reading a story only she could feel. After an hour, she stopped. "It's here," she whispered. "Close." They stood before a sheer rock wall, unremarkable from any other. But Cal noticed something, a series of faint, almost invisible carvings, covered in lichen and worn by centuries of wind and rain. They matched the serpent symbol on her wrist. Ilara traced the carvings with her fingers. "There's a sequence," she said. "A riddle my father taught me. Where the serpent meets the sun at midday." She looked up. The sun was directly overhead, and a single narrow beam of light pierced the canyon gloom, illuminating a small, perfectly round depression in the rock. She pressed her thumb into it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low grinding sound echoed from deep within the stone. A section of the rock wall, a massive, multi-ton slab, began to slide sideways, revealing a dark, square opening. The entrance to the vault. They stepped inside. The air was cool and still, and smelled of old paper and dry dust. The massive stone door ground shut behind them, plunging them into absolute darkness and silence. Kyle struck a match. The small flame illuminated a vast, circular chamber. The walls were lined not with gold or jewels, but with shelves. Thousands upon thousands of shelves, filled with leather-bound books, scrolls, and strange, intricate brass instruments. It was real. The library was real. In the center of the room, on a stone pedestal, was a heavy, iron-bound lockbox. Ilara rushed to it, her hands trembling as she pulled the locket from around her neck. She inserted the strange, star-shaped key. With a loud click, the lock opened. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were her father's journals. Thick, leather-bound volumes filled with his elegant, precise handwriting. She lifted the top one, her eyes filling with tears. "We have it," she whispered. "We have the proof." But as she lifted the journal, she revealed what was underneath it. A second, identical locket. Cal's blood ran cold. He took the locket from her. It was heavier than hers. He pried it open. It didn't contain a key. It contained a miniature, exquisitely painted portrait. A portrait of a beautiful, smiling woman with kind eyes and long dark hair. And beneath the portrait, a single, faded word was inscribed. "Mama?" Ilara stared at it, her face a mask of confusion. "But my mother died when I was a baby. I never knew her." Kel's heart was hammering against his ribs. He knew that face. He had only seen it once, in a faded photograph on a dusty mantelpiece, but he had never forgotten it. The woman in the portrait was the wife of Sergeant Silas, the woman who had supposedly died of fever 10 years ago, right before Silas deserted his post and founded Haven. This wasn't just a random connection. Ilara's father had known Silas's wife, and he had hidden her portrait in his most secret and valuable possession. And that's when Kale realized the devastating truth. Ilara wasn't a Finch. She wasn't the descendant of some ancient, secret society. That was all a lie. A story her father had told her to protect her. Her real father was Silas, and the brand on her wrist wasn't the mark of a guardian. It was the mark of a test subject. The revelation hit Kale with the force of a physical blow. The story Alara had been told her whole life, the grand legacy of a secret society, it was all a fabrication. The brand, he said, his voice hoarse. Your violet eyes. It's not from your bloodline, is it? He remembered the books, the strange scientific instruments. This wasn't a library of history. It was a laboratory. The Ouroboros Society weren't just guardians of knowledge. They were scientists conducting experiments. And Alara and her mother before her were a part of those experiments. Before Alara could process this, they heard it, a faint, rhythmic scraping sound coming from the walls of the vault. Thorn. He hadn't been fooled by the battle in Haven. He had known all along. He had followed them. And now he was drilling his way in. They were trapped, again. The tunnels! Ilara cried, her mind reeling from the shock of the discovery. We have to find the escape tunnels. She frantically scanned her father's journals, her fingers flying across the pages filled with diagrams, equations, and notes. Here, she said, pointing to a map at the back of the last volume. There's an exit. It leads into the riverbed, 5 miles south of here. The drilling sound was getting louder, closer. They could hear the shouts of Thorne's men. They found the entrance to the tunnel hidden behind a false bookshelf. It was a narrow, dark passage, just as her father's map described. But as Cale pushed the heavy stone door open, he froze. The air that wafted out wasn't stale. It was fresh, and it carried a faint, familiar scent. Sagebrush and campfire smoke. Someone was already in the tunnels. Cal drew his knife, signaling for Alara to stay back. He crept into the darkness, his eyes slowly adjusting. The tunnel opened into a small antechamber, lit by a single, low-burning torch. A man sat by the fire, his back to them. He was an old man, his hair white as snow, his buckskin clothes worn and ancient. He was a medicine man, an Apache elder. The man turned and Cale's breath caught in his throat. He knew this man. It was Geronimo, not the fierce warrior of legend, but an old, tired man with eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 years. But he wasn't the one who made Cale's blood run cold. It was the man standing beside him, the man who stepped out of the shadows, a rifle held loosely in his hands. It was Cale's brother, Chayton. I was wondering when you would get here, little brother, Chayton said, his voice flat. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it left Cale speechless. His own brother, working with Thorne. Chayton, why? Cale finally managed to ask. Why? Chayton sneered. Because I am tired of watching our people die. I am tired of the white man's worthless treaties and broken promises. Thorne is a man of power. He made me an offer. An offer to do what? Ilara asked, stepping into the light. Chayton's eyes widened as he saw her. He looked from her strange violet eyes to the journal in her hand. He offered me a weapon, Chayton said, his voice dropping to a low, fanatical whisper. He showed me the writings in this vault, the formulas, the plans for weapons that could drive the white man from our lands forever. He promised to help me build them, in exchange for the girl and the full contents of this library. The final horrifying piece of the puzzle fell into place. Thorne didn't want the knowledge for himself. He wanted to arm the tribes, to start a massive, bloody war across the entire territory. A war that would send the railroad's stock plummeting, allowing him to buy it up for pennies on the dollar. A war that would make him the undisputed king of the West. He wasn't just a monster. He was a madman. The sound of the drill breaking through the vault wall echoed down the tunnel. Thorne and his men would be here in minutes. Kyle looked at his brother, at the mad gleam in his eyes, and knew that he was lost. You would sacrifice her? Kyle asked, his voice shaking with rage. You would sacrifice our own sacred lands, our own people, for a war you cannot win? Sacrifice is necessary for victory, Chayton roared. He raised his rifle. But before he could fire, another figure moved in the shadows. Silas. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds, his face a mask of grime and fury. But he was alive, and his shotgun was aimed directly at Chayton. You're not the only one who knows these tunnels, you son of a bitch, Silas growled. The standoff was absolute, a triangle of hatred and betrayal in the flickering torchlight. And then, The wall of the vault behind them exploded inward. Captain Thorne stepped through the dust and debris, a triumphant smile on his face. "Excellent," he said, his eyes taking in the scene. "All the players together for the final act." The chaos was absolute. Thorne's men poured into the vault, their rifles firing. Chaitin's warriors, who had been hidden in the tunnels, emerged, firing their own arrows and rifles. The ancient library became a battlefield. Kyle tackled Ilara, pulling her behind a massive stone shelf as bullets and arrows flew past them. "The journal!" he yelled over the din. "Is there anything else? Any other way out?" She frantically flipped through the pages. There's a failsafe, a structural weakness. My father noted it. If a charge is set here," she pointed to a spot on the map, a central support pillar, "the whole complex will collapse." It was their only chance to destroy the knowledge, to bury Thorne and his insane war forever. Silas laid down covering fire, his shotgun booming in the enclosed space. "Go!" he yelled at Kyle. "I'll hold them off." Kyle saw the look on his face. Silas wasn't just fighting for a town, he was fighting for the daughter he never knew he had. Kyle and Ilara ran, weaving through the firefight. They reached the central pillar. Kyle saw a small, pre-drilled hole, just as the journal described, a place for a demolition charge. But they had no explosives. Then Kyle remembered. The brass instruments, the strange, intricate devices on the shelves. They weren't scientific tools. They were bombs. The Ouroboros Society had built a self-destruct mechanism into their own library. He found the device, a complex sphere of brass and wires. Ilara, reading from the journal, told him the sequence to arm it. Just as he set the timer, a bullet slammed into his shoulder. He cried out, stumbling back. Thorne stood over him, his pistol aimed at Cale's head. "It's over, Coyote. I told you I would hunt you down." But as he was about to fire, Silas charged him, roaring like a wounded bear. He tackled Thorne, and the two old soldiers crashed to the ground in a brutal, final struggle. "Get her out of here!" Silas screamed at Cale, his hands locked around Thorne's throat. Cale grabbed Ilara, and they ran for the tunnel. As they plunged into the darkness, he looked back one last time. He saw Silas, a knife in his gut, still holding on to Thorne. He saw Chaitin, struck by a stray bullet from one of Thorne's own men, fall to his knees. And then he saw the flash. A brilliant, silent flash of light that lit up the entire tunnel. It was followed by a deep, world-shaking roar as the mountain collapsed in on itself, burying the library, the secrets, the hatred, and the bodies of heroes and madmen alike. Kyle and Ilara were thrown from the tunnel mouth by the force of the blast, landing in the soft sand of the riverbed. They were alive, they were free, and they were utterly alone. They walked for 2 days, two silent, wounded ghosts in a world that had been shattered and remade. Cale's shoulder was a fiery ball of pain. Ilara was in shock, the foundations of her entire life ripped away. On the third day, they saw the smoke of a campfire. They approached cautiously, but it was not an enemy. It was what was left of the people of Haven and the warriors of Chaitin's band. Two broken peoples brought together by a shared tragedy. The Apache elder Geronimo was with them. He looked at Cale, then at Ilara. "The mountain is quiet now," he said, his voice like the whisper of the wind. "The evil has been buried." He looked at Cale's wound, and at the deeper wound in his soul. "Your brother fought with honor at the end. He died protecting his people from his own mistake. He will be remembered." Then he turned to Ilara. "And you, child with the star-colored eyes, you have lost a father you never knew, and another who raised you. You have no home, no tribe." Ilara looked down at her hands, the journals clutched tightly within them. All that was left of her past. Cale stepped forward, his body aching, but his voice clear. "She is not without a tribe," he said, looking at the weary faces of the survivors around the fire. "We are all outcasts now. We are the survivors of Haven and the people of Chaitin's band. We have no leaders, no home." He looked at Ilara, a silent promise passing between them. "So we will make a new one," he said, "together." The prophecy Tala had spoken echoed in his mind. The lost child will lead the broken warrior home. He finally understood. Home wasn't a place you found. It was a place you built. And this, here, in the ashes of their old lives, was where they would begin. They didn't rebuild Haven. They didn't go back to the old camp. They found a new place, a hidden valley with fresh water and fertile soil, a place where they could start again. The journals of Alistair Finch were not a curse. They were a gift. They contained knowledge of architecture, of irrigation, of agriculture. Kyle and Alara used them to build their new home, a community where settlers and Apache could live together, bound not by blood, but by a shared hope for a better future. It wasn't easy. The ghosts of the past were long and dark, but they endured. 1 year later, Kale stood on a ridge overlooking their new, thriving settlement. The valley was green, filled with crops and the sounds of children laughing. He was no longer the coyote, the broken warrior running from his past. He was a leader, a builder. Ilara came and stood beside him. Her violet eyes were no longer filled with sorrow, but with a quiet, fierce strength. She was no longer a lost girl. She was a founder, a mother to her new people. Silas would be proud, she said softly. Chayton, too, Kyle replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, roughly carved piece of wood. It was a cradle, small enough to fit in his hand, a promise of the future. He had spent the last week making it. He placed it in her hand. It's time, he said. She smiled, a true, radiant smile that chased away the last of the shadows. Yeah, she said, it is. They had been brought together by violence and lies, two lost souls on the edge of a canyon. But in the heart of that darkness, they had found the truth. Not just about a hidden library or a madman's war, but about themselves. They had found that the only treasure worth fighting for, the only knowledge worth protecting, was the kind that builds bridges instead of walls, the kind that leads you home. If you were inspired by this story of survival and the courage to build a new beginning, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. There are always more stories out here on the edge of the world, just waiting to be told.